From the studios of KOOP HD1 HD3 Hornsby, this is People's Republic with Brian Griffith. We bring you news and analysis from the global struggle for social and economic justice. I'm your host, Brian Griffith, and here's what's going down in your backyard and across the world. Welcome to People's Republic. I, of course, am Brian Griffith, and this week we are talking about the January 12th rally to free Griselda, a mother and survivor protecting her child. This is going to be going on at the Laredo Processing Center in Laredo, Texas. This is an important point in the struggle for immigrant rights, for survivor justice, and for the rights and justice around asylum seekers. Joining us to talk about all this and more is Martha Mercado, an activist with the Immigrant Rights Committee of the Democratic Socialists of America. Thank you, Martha, for coming on.
Hi, thank you for having me.
And we are also joined by Sofia Casini, an immigrants' rights organizer with Grassroots Leadership. Thank you, Sofia, for coming on the show.
Thank you, Brian.
So let's start by kind of getting people caught up with who Griselda is, what the issue around, because this actually originated in the Don Hutto Detention Center in Taylor, Texas, about an hour or so out of Austin. This is a story around asylum seeker justice that has really, kind of taken us all across Texas. So can we kind of set the scene for who Griselda is, what the Don Hutto Detention Center is, and why Griselda has been transferred?
Mm-hmm. So Griselda is an asylum seeker from El Salvador who's in our country asking for safety because her life has been threatened repeatedly from gangs targeting her and targeting her family. Last year, her abusive ex called immigration on her when she was living in Chicago. And this is something that we see all over the country. It's a widespread issue with abusers using immigration as a weapon against survivors. She left him and he made good on that, and he took her daughter in the process, deporting her to El Salvador and taking her 5-year-old little girl. Fast forward, and Griselda has come back into our country, escaping from those same gangs issuing renewed death threats. And she finds herself in the Don Hutto Detention Center. That's about 45 minutes away. 500 women, all asylum seekers. Grassroots Leadership has a program there where we match community members with women detained to monitor human rights and to help them speak up for their rights and speak up for justice and get free. What happened with Griselda is she did exactly that. She spoke out to press, she spoke out to community, she spoke out to leaders in the town of Taylor, Texas, surrounding the detention center, saying that she desperately needed to get free because her little daughter, Samantha, was being physically and we think sexually abused by her father, the same man who used ICE as a weapon against her. When speaking out, she got retaliated against. In the middle of the night, they first forced her to sign her deportation. She refused, knowing that that meant imminent death. And then they transferred her overnight to the Laredo Detention Center.
And so now, first of all, there's so much that's just absolutely horrifying about the way this is played out. And it seems to be an intersection, as we, of so many kind of justice issues that we've talked about over and over again, all of which kind of converge and really, go to show like this whole system is just disgusting. I don't want to say it's broken because, in fact, the kind of the immigration system as it is, the Border Patrol system and the ICE are functioning kind of as, in many ways, they were kind of intended to. They were a militarized force for the oppression of immigrant peoples. So I'd like for first of all, can we start by just kind of talking about the actual event? What we're doing to kind of organize around this, and what people who might be interested in helping Griselda in this time of extreme need, where they might be able to go again for more information, and what this January 12th rally to free Griselda is all about.
Right. So we're going to be going to Laredo, Texas to let Griselda and ICE know that we will support her no matter where she has moved to. We will be actually going out from a bus here in Austin, Texas, to show how many people we have that really support the cause. Another thing is that we're organizing with people on the ground in Laredo. I think the name of the group is Laredo Immigrant Alliance. And we want to see a supportive community come together. We're also hoping to have some people carpool in from San Antonio. And so we're dedicating, here in Austin, we'll be dedicating the day to this trip. I think we'll be there from leaving around 8, coming back around 7, to have about 2 hours of direct action outside the facility. We're very interested to see how the facility itself will react. But more than anything, we want the people in Laredo to know what's going on right there in this little plaza. You know, you wouldn't suspect a thing, because a lot of people aren't aware of the abuses that are going on in their own hometown. And it can be really hard to imagine that, you know, such a case is going on in a place where you know and love and have grown up, and maybe people you know and love work there at this facility. But it's our job to, you know, show the people what's going on to Griselda and how she's being separated from her daughter. And I think something interesting that Sofia didn't mention is that Griselda had been living in the United States for 10 years, you know? So it's just like you can be picked up out of nowhere. So to learn more about the actual event, you can go to the Grassroots Leadership Facebook page, where we have the event there itself. But yeah, Sofia, do you have anything else to add?
When I think of this rally, I think of two things. I think one is just awareness raising of the way immigration is functioning, the kind of abuses in that facility. Laredo has long been known as a punishment facility. When people who are detained speak up for their rights, they're transferred to Laredo. And what we know in Laredo, for example, they give medication, very powerful medication, which creates a heart attack feeling that people have passed out from. This happened to Griselda. On top of everything else she's struggling with her family separation, she also has acute head injury that's not being treated. So this kind of medical neglect, abusive treatment, this is how these detention centers function. It's being run by a private prison company called Core Civic, the same one that runs Teton Hutto, and they cut costs at every page. So we want to, yes, raise awareness to the people of Laredo, to the people in Austin, to the people in our community. But more than that, these rallies, they work. People really do get released. So more than once, time and again, we have come together and banded in this kind of very powerful action, and we've been able to get asylum seekers freed. Because there's nothing at all in our law that says an asylum seeker has to be locked up. Griselda could live in community with her family. Her older son wants her. He has space for her. There's no reason that she's detained except for that we're making money off her body, just as profit. And so we want to send a very clear message to ICE. ICE, if they get enough public pressure, what we've seen, if they get enough public pressure where it starts to give them the kind of bad reputation for the things that they're actually doing, they will back down and they will release people.
Yeah, I think the proof really is in the pudding. The proof of the fact that these actions work is in the fact that ICE thought that they could essentially avoid the public pressure by sort of transferring Griselda out, because as we've seen with the grassroots leadership campaign here, kind of around Austin and in Taylor, was that the Taylor in particular is this very kind of like a small southern community where in many ways they were completely kind of unaware of what was going on, when that awareness, or from my understanding, a lot of them were unaware of kind of the fact that essentially this prison facility was being used to house asylum seekers in these horrific conditions. In fact, it's a prison rather than any sort of kind of residential area. So as grassroots leadership, to me, put more pressure on the facility there and made the residents of Taylor more aware, there was this kind of pressure coming from the outside, and then there were also people speaking out from the inside that kind of forced them to, or it didn't force them to move. They chose to move Griselda to avoid this kind of public accountability out to Laredo. And to me, that just goes to show the importance of kind of solidarity, across the state and across the nation, so that when something like this happens, no matter where they think they can kind of avoid accountability, they need to know that there's going to be a local presence there, that there are going to be people there saying, you cannot do this here. You cannot, bring this stuff here and think we're not going to speak out against it. And to me, that's kind of a very powerful way to be fighting back against this.
Mm-hmm. You make a really critical point, Brian, is that Griselda inside of detention has been speaking up with great personal courage and at great risk to speak like this, as have other women detained. So she is not the only one. Hunger strike leaders have spoken up for their freedom, for the rights of others, sexual assault survivors. There's a group of women who were formerly detained in this same detention center who are now fighting actively to free Griselda now that they themselves have been released. So this is a much larger movement of people on the outside community, as well as people who are still locked up in these detention centers and people formerly detained, all coming together.
Yeah, and so again, that's going to be a rally to free Griselda, mother and survivor protecting her child. That's the name of the Facebook event. You can find that on the Facebook page of Grassroots Leadership, which is an Austin-based community organization with the handle Grassroots Leadership. That's going to be on January 12th, and that's where you can find more information, or I believe on the Grassroots Leadership website. So I'd like to, with that being understood, with that going on in our community and in Laredo, I want to kind of turn to more kind of bigger picture issues of what's actually been going on with regard to the Hutto Detention Center and what the kind of real ramifications there are, because I believe I'm forgetting the exact statistic, but I believe the Hutto Detention Center makes what is around $100 per person per day that they essentially imprison. They cut down cost essentially by using the imprisoned labor of these asylum seekers who essentially do all the work for the detention center in ways that to me absolutely resemble slave labor. So I'm wondering if you can kind of speak more to the conditions in Hutto and how this may be pretty exemplary of how our prison industrial complex also spills over into the way the U.S. handles immigration and asylum.
So what we've seen for years through our visitation program is that the way this detention center functions is, like you said, very much a prison, using prison labor. 500 women detained. They're doing all the cooking, the cleaning. They are paid $1 a day, $1.50 a day for their labor. Some of them are never even paid. They'll go weeks without getting their money. And this money is used to call their families. It's their commissary money. So it can be the difference between a 19-year-old talking to her mother or not getting a chance to talk to her family. They cut costs at every corner. I've had women talk to me about throwing up blood. I've had women very, very sick. We've tried to get them help at all angles. We had 2 women with diabetes last year almost die inside of detention because of their medical mistreatment. They both signed their own voluntary deportation, saying they would rather go back to their countries and face potential death than face their fears of dying inside of this detention center. We also know that the Hutto Detention Center specifically is infamous around the country for sexual assault. For years and years and years, survivors have been coming forward saying that they are being abused, sexually abused by the guards inside the center and by ICE officials. And when that's raised up, there's no accountability. The women themselves are transferred out or pushed to sign their deportation, and the guards get off scot-free.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but there are actually some lawsuits against Hutto right now, right?
That's right.
From the women, I'm not sure if it's from the 8 women who were sexually assaulted.
Actually, the 8 women that were sexually assaulted in 2011, their guard, he was assaulting women as he was taking them to be deported in their van. Mm-hmm. That one closed. He got less than a year. And so justice did not get served. The active lawsuit right now is a woman around employment violations, and she's doing a class action lawsuit for her $1.50 a day pay.
Mm-hmm.
Wow. So the person who assaulted these women received less than a year jail time for having done that.
That's right.
Meanwhile, the women themselves, for the not crime, which it is not a crime to seek asylum, for having done absolutely nothing criminal, for seeking asylum in many cases for the, essentially trying to escape the fallout of the U.S.'s own kind of military and paramilitary actions throughout Central America, are for trying to escape that are being imprisoned kind of indefinitely. Is there any, and as we talked about, there's kind of this financial motive for keeping them in prison. The company Core Civic, which runs the Hutto Detention Center, has actually sued the state of New Mexico, for not providing enough prisoners. So there's this kind of like its entire financial incentive, its entire kind of reason for existence is to imprison as many people as possible, to keep as many people as possible behind bars, regardless of the actual needs or lack of needs of society. There's this kind of just financial incentive to keep everybody in prison.
So ICE is actually the only government agency that has a bed quota. Which means they are contracted to have a certain number of individuals detained. I believe that number is 34,000.
Wow.
Yeah.
And do you know what the sort of rationale behind that bed quota is? Is there kind of a...
It's part of a larger lobbying machine. So if you scale back all the way to the way our immigration laws are created, Core Civic, this private prison company, they are the same company that works in the prison industry. It's really cross-cutting. They lock up black and brown bodies for profit. And that's what this is about. It's to push people down for power and to push people down to make money off their bodies. And so Core Civic now, it figured out, detention, this is big money. And they moved into the immigrant space to make it to where, for example, in the past, it was not illegal to cross the border twice. There was no law against it. Now it is. They're very, very sophisticated, highly paid lobbyists from these private prison companies push on our elected officials and actually help them write their laws behind the scenes. It's all campaign finance. It's all profit motive. And then you get these draconian asylum seeker and immigration policies that we're fighting with today. Mm-hmm. At the root is trying to lock people up for profit.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's regardless of, there's no societal need for this. There's no society never at any point needed a prison industrial complex, and yet here we are. If anything, and absolutely it is detrimental to society, both as sort of a general concept and, of course, detrimental to all the kind of individual people, some of the in many ways already the most oppressed and marginalized people in the world. Yeah, it's detrimental to them, very obviously.
So as someone who was a part of the Grassroots Leadership Visitation Program for a minute, something I can speak to is that there's actually this song, I think it's by Los Tigres del Norte, that's called Jaula de Oro, Cage of Gold. And I think really, when these migrants come and cross the border and are then dubbed undocumented, quote unquote, illegal immigrants, they are put in these detention facilities. And really, when your life is threatened, like the horror stories I've heard from just a week of volunteer service at Dilley Detention Center, a family detention center, and also from the visitation program with Hutto, the reasons that these people leave these countries are inexplicably horrible. They are just terror stories. And so, you go from that horrible atmosphere to being in this prison, but it looks so sterile, everything's white. And so I think for a minute, these women might feel like they're okay, right? But then it becomes very apparent. The abuse becomes very apparent. And so sometimes these women hesitate to speak up because the conditions, it's like a different kind of abuse from the abuse that in their hometown, right? But this is like legal abuse, really. And so they start to speak out. And that's where we come in, where grassroots leadership comes in, is when they start to speak out. We try to publicize the campaigns, the individual campaigns. the conditions occasionally, like during the hunger strike, where the 27 women, I think, who participated in the hunger strike, grassroots leadership, took the letters that these women wrote and publicized them. And all of those women ended up being transferred to different facilities. Again, that's how ICE retaliates. But anyway, all this to say that I think people come here, hoping for freedom, as a daughter of immigrants. I know America, freedom, those are basically synonyms in our language, right? And then we find out we're locked in a cage. It's another cage. This one's just a golden cage, but we're facing different abuses here. These immigrant women, these immigrant families and children are facing different abuses here that I don't think they could have imagined in their hometown, where danger just looks different there. And here it's militarized police, militarized government agencies.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I absolutely think that most people, if they were to, sort of travel a little bit more and were to, well, I don't even want to say travel, because I feel like some people use travel to just kind of, prop up their own confirmation biases. But I feel like if people were to sort of experience more of, kind of the world outside the U.S., they would realize just how kind of horrific a dystopia this had already become. And this is not a Trump administration thing. This is a thing that is kind of the U.S. capitalist state as it exists and as it always has existed. I've been reading a few kind of books by Gerald Horne and Roxanne Dunbar-Artis that kind of decolonize the history of the United States. And I think that, so much of this kind of extreme hyper-militarization has been sort of at the very core of the U.S. project for a very long time. And I would, for all of the kind of rhetoric around liberty, I think, most people at this point are finally kind of seeing it behind the mask for what this really is, what this whole system really is. One of my kind of concerns is that some people will, especially kind of liberal-minded people, will think that this is somehow just a kind of Trump phenomenon, and then, in a next presidential election or two presidential elections from now or whatnot, will just go back to sort of this Obama-esque kind of complacency, when in many ways both the kind of horrors that many people from Central America are fleeing from, such as the 2009 coup in Honduras, and many of the kind of militarized ICE and other the kind of prison industrial complex that they're finding when they arrive here are have gone on for many successive presidential administrations, both Republican and Democrat, kind of just unimpeded since about, at least the Reagan administration onward. So I guess, Sofia, having kind of worked in immigrants' rights organizing for a while, can you maybe speak to how things have shifted over the last couple presidential administrations?
Yeah, I think that's right, that this is a long-standing problem, and it's much more to do with the core crux of how we move in the world as a country and in our own society. I will say that things have shifted. Things have markedly shifted under Trump, and I don't think it can be ignored. I think there are two realities. There's a reality that, as much as there are many, many things that Obama is well loved for and deserving of, that he deported more people than the past presidents, for sure.
I think his nickname was a deporter-in-chief.
That's right. So many people deported and a lot of money put towards border security. Under Trump, what we see is an attack, a direct attack, a manipulated narrative, far more extreme, of this kind of fear-based rhetoric. And the hate crimes have gone through the roof, as have twisting of the policies. So trying to attack on who can be an asylum seeker. You can no longer, if you're fleeing domestic violence or gangs. Now, that got struck down, but there's a way in which, with the family separation, yes, families have been separating a long time, but not the way that Trump did it, direct in policy, criminalizing the families. So I think it's worth noting that there has been a shift. I actually take a lot of hope, though, in the people who are stepping forward in this moment, because even though some of it is a little inaccurate, like, oh, it's new, and so people are getting charged and involved, it's exposing things that have long been the issue with these detention centers, the abusive conditions and treatment inside of them. That is not new, but it's being exposed in a brand new way. And so when people are getting involved and people are getting active and people are seeing that, the way these children are treated in the centers, I get a lot of hope from that. And I think that's a really positive development that's going to continue on far past this current administration.
I will say, for me personally, it has been a little hard seeing that people only start to care when they see kids in cages. Because anyone in a cage matters. I completely understand the vulnerability. But like Sofia, I'm, devastated to see this in the public light. I mean, just like, I think being a person of color and seeing the representation in abuse, not seeing it so much in, places of power or places of, liberation, but seeing it in places of abuse, it's hard seeing Black and brown bodies like that. So it's this rally to free Griselda, she's just one of so many, but that's how we're going to, until this whole system falls apart, we're going to have to save people one by one is almost what it feels like. Mm-hmm. So this is a part of that movement.
Yeah. And I also think, since we have a few minutes left, I'd like to, remind people once again that we're talking about the rally to free Griselda that's going on January 12th in Laredo, Texas. The organization Grassroots Leadership is organizing a bus from Austin as well as a carpool from San Antonio to support the asylum seeker Griselda. Who was retaliated against for speaking out. Essentially, ICE retaliated against her when she spoke out against her treatment in the Hutto Detention Center. So, I will be trying to attend that. And, there will be a lot of other people coming from Austin and San Antonio down to Laredo to be a part of that and to speak out against ICE and for asylum seekers. I think, to me, this is understood that while this is specifically focused on Griselda, obviously this is a rally in support of all asylum seekers that are being held in these horrific conditions. So the information on that is on a Grassroots Leadership Facebook page. And also on a Grassroots Leadership website, which I believe is just grassrootsleadership.org. So we have maybe a few minutes left to kind of generally reflect on where the kind of struggle for asylum seekers goes next, because I feel like this is taking this to Laredo is really a step forward in kind of building that network, to me, of understanding that ICE cannot simply transfer the people out who have the highest visibility and transfer them somewhere else, but in fact wherever it is they set up communities, those communities need to be there, or wherever it is that ICE sets up these just horrific detention centers in communities, these communities need to be there to kind of speak out against them, to say that this is not going to happen in our community. We don't stand for this. So I'm wondering what sort of thoughts you have either on that or just generally other kind of things you'd like to add to the conversation.
I think this is a movement around the country. What we're seeing is in front of their own detention centers, in their own backyards, people are moving forward and they're speaking out. And we're starting to see some of these detention centers get challenged in a very serious way and get closed down. So the Teton Hutto Detention Center, the county of Williamson County, an extremely conservative county, just voted to cut that contract. And there's a good possibility that facility is going to be shut down. This, again, all around the country, people are fighting for an end to detention. These places are not needed. I think of it a lot like Japanese internment camps. There was once a day where that was not only legal in our country, but morally acceptable. Where now, if you ask the general public, was that okay? The vast majority of people will say, absolutely not. We made a mistake. I do think there's going to be a day in the future where we look at this whole massive detention center industry and we say the same. We shut down all of these facilities. People instead live in community with their families or in safe shelters that have been set up where they can come and go freely. And we look back on the day when we had these horrible places and we feel a sense of shame and a sense of relief that we've overcome them.
And I think to accomplish this, we really need to keep an eye on groups, for-profit groups like Core Civic and Geo Group. Those are two of the biggest for-profit private prison industry corporations. So, I'm a student at Texas State, and I studied a lot about Core Civic this year, working with grassroots leadership. And they actually started by transforming this little hotel. They had 24 hours to turn this hotel, that property that they just got, into a detention center. And the founder of Core Civic, T. Don Hutto, actually is his name, proudly says, there are interviews where this man proudly says, yeah, I took the pictures myself of these detainees, because they were on such a short budget. So it's a very ugly history. But this man has been very cunning, and this organization, actually, Core Civic started as Corrections Corporation of America. They just rebranded these past few years recently from CCA, what they were infamously known as, to Core Civic. They changed their logo. They were affiliated with ALEC, the American Legislative. I'm blanking on the last two. It's a very conservative group, ALEC, that helped pass that 3 strikes law, that minimum sentencing. They helped pass laws like these, the Show Me Your Papers law in Arizona. So Core Civic, CCA then, Core Civic now, worked with ALEC behind doors to get toxic laws like these passed. And now they're trying to cleanse that with their image. And actually, I think they're going into, their newest thing is going into ankle monitoring technology. They're shifting even from prisons to immigration system to now technology. And that's what they pride themselves on is innovative government solutions. And so I think we really need to keep an eye on this organization, Core Civic and Geo Group. And honestly, whenever I read articles, they say these are the 2 biggest groups. They don't really go into detail about anything else. That's how little is known about these groups.
Yeah, no, that to me speaks so much to the kind of power and sway they hold. Generally, those kind of organizations that we know the least about, and I would also kind of throw in the kind of military industrial, whether it's the contractors, the general weapons contractors like a Boeing or whatnot, or the on the kind of mercenary side, groups like Blackwater, which just it kind of reminded me of the same thing when Blackwater kind of rebranded as Academy, the kind of U.S. mercenaries that I believe, I don't know if that group in particular is still in Syria, but in fact, the U.S. Military, the U.S. Pentagon, or the Pentagon has done much of the same thing, and sort of shifting so much of this, what used to at least be done by the state, and shifting it to these kind of private companies where they have this kind of kind of barrier, as closely as they work together, where it's essentially this public-private horrifying partnership, but that gives them the kind of plausible deniability to allow these kind of atrocities to continue to be carried out in many ways. And I think we do need to keep watching these. We will continue to keep covering this on the show. This is not something we're going to let go, and we plan on, having a regular monthly segment about the prison industrial complex, especially that around immigrants and asylum seekers, carrying on into the new year. So to kind of wrap it all up, we have been talking with Sofia Casini, who's an immigrants' rights organizer with Grassroots Leadership, as well as Martha Mercado, an activist with the Immigrant Rights Committee of the Democratic Socialists of America, about the rally to free Griselda, which is coming up on January 12th. So thank you both very much for coming on the show, and hope to have you again soon.
Thank you very much.
Hope to see you soon.
People's Republic originates on KOOP 91.7 FM in Austin, and is also broadcasting on WHIV 102.3 FM in New Orleans. We are also available as a podcast on SoundCloud, Spotify, Spreaker, Stitcher, iTunes, or wherever podcasts are podded. You can find the show by typing in People's Republic with Brian Griffith on any of those platforms. For the second half of the show, because we are just getting back from, essentially our New Year's break, or a holiday break rather, I would like to air an earlier speech that was recorded from Gloria La Riva. Gloria La Riva was the 2016 presidential candidate from the Party for Socialism and Liberation, and she gave a speech on kind of the contemporary state of Latin American affairs at the PSL's regional conference in Albuquerque, New Mexico. That was a Southwest Socialism Conference that took place, I believe it was in early August. So yeah, that's going to be the second half of the show today. I hope you enjoy, and I hope this is very informative for you, because a lot of really sort of interesting political developments here that I think tie into our earlier conversation about asylum seekers. So yeah, thanks for listening, and stay tuned.
Yeah, it's good to see you all, everybody here. I'm always glad to see the growing struggle in Albuquerque, being from here. It's still my hometown. But I think the speeches this morning showed how much the party is needed in New Mexico, that this is why the military-industrial complex, why the Pentagon decided in the 1940s to build the bomb and to build its nuclear weapons industry in the state, which it considered to be so disenfranchised and too poor to really wage a struggle. In fact, I remember on the 50th anniversary of the bombing of Nagasaki and Hiroshima, we went to Los Alamos to commemorate it, and we met workers who had been hired at the time as maintenance people in the Manhattan Project, and they were chosen for being illiterate so that they wouldn't know what was going on. But so it's great to see, it's encouraging to see so many people involved here in Albuquerque and the whole Southwest. Latin America is not getting much attention in the news of the United States, except to portray the countries in progressive struggle, revolutionary struggle, as basket cases, deserving of U.S. intervention to rescue it, really to rescue the resources for the U.S. That's all you really hear about Venezuela and Nicaragua, blaming them for what the U.S. is really responsible for. But it's not possible to understand what's taken place in either of those two countries without looking at the developments and events of the last 10 years in Latin America, well, of course, before that, from 2009 to 2018. The decade before that, from 1999 to 2009, there was significant movement forward with the election of progressive presidents in several countries, starting with Hugo Chávez's election in Venezuela, which started the Bolivarian Revolution. He was elected in 1998, took office in 1999. Evo Morales became president in Bolivia in 2005. Rafael Correa in Ecuador in 2006. Then Daniel Ortega in Nicaragua was later that year and re-elected in 2009. Actually 2011 and 2016. There were also the elections in that decade between 1999 and 2009 of Lula da Silva of the Workers' Party in Brazil and Nestor Kirchner and later his wife Cristina Fernandez in Argentina, which began in 2003. Those two were not socialist, but relatively progressive, and improve the conditions of the working class in their countries. And of course, there is Cuba's steadfastness in defending its revolution for so many years. All of this was taking place in the decade of the 2000s. There was so much progress. And yet now the people of Latin America are experiencing a serious and often violent setback in their countries, counter-revolutionary attacks. And the U.S. government is behind the fostering of that opposition. And of course, James from the Alliance for Global Justice from Arizona just talked about the crisis in Colombia. In recent months, U.S. officials are intensifying pressure on their allies in Latin America against those progressive governments. Former Secretary of State Rex Tillerson appealed to elements within the Bolivarian military to overthrow President Nicolás Maduro, and Trump has threatened military action. Mike Pence's visit to Ecuador in late June was followed immediately by the new right-wing Ecuadorian President Lenín Moreno's announcement that whistleblower Julian Assange would likely not be given refuge in the Ecuadorian embassy in London. In the last 10 years, as I said, the government has intensified its efforts, covert and overt, to recover its place of geopolitical and economic domination in Latin America and the Caribbean. U.S. funds are being poured into destabilization campaigns of subversion to reverse the revolutionary turn in the continent. And it's having a serious effect. But despite the most blatant racist and imperialist actions of Trump, this new offensive of the United States against Latin America did not start with his administration. The latest offensive started, in fact, with President Barack Obama soon after he took office in 2009. After all, one of the first actions of his government was to support, if not engineer, the Honduran coup against the president, Mel Zelaya. And of course, Hillary Clinton, being the Secretary of State, boasted in her book of her role in supporting the new coup government until her second edition, when she took that little part out to run for president. Of course, let's not forget, during Obama's first term, the destruction of Libya and the devastating war that began against Syria. The Democrats' role cannot be overlooked, as others have said, or ignored, because as the 2020 election cycle looms before us, even before the midterm elections of November, the progressive movement and working class will be told once again that the only way out of their crisis that we are facing, economic, social, political, is to put aside protests. Don't pressure the Democrats. Work all that you can in the next 2 years. Ignore history and support them to become the new party to rule. But the history of the U.S. and Latin America and the Caribbean, whether Democrat, Republican, has been of military coups, CIA plots to overthrow governments who did not have elections that turned out in its favor, assassinate leaders, all to back U.S. corporate and geopolitical interests. And it was Obama who clearly signaled this new tactical approach in U.S. strategy of domination when he was first campaigning for president in 2008. He gave his Latin America-themed speech in May 2008 in Miami, that city being the seat of the Latin American counter-revolution. In fact, he spoke before the Cuban American National Foundation, the notorious group founded under Reagan's term that was designed to strengthen the policy of strangling the Cuban economy. The foundation also received tens of millions of dollars in CIA funding to carry out terrorist attacks against Cuba. So here was Obama in Miami with this fascist group. And he announced a new approach to achieve the same goal. Here's a telling excerpt from his speech. He said, "Since the Bush administration's action launched a misguided war in Iraq, its policy in the Americas has been negligent toward our friends, ineffective with our adversaries, and incapable of advancing our interests in the region. No wonder, then, that demagogues like Hugo Chavez have stepped into the vacuum. His predictable yet perilous mix of anti-American rhetoric, authoritarian government, and checkbook diplomacy offers the same false promise as the tried and failed ideologies of the present." He means socialism. He goes on, "But the United States is so alienated from the rest of the Americas that this stale vision has gone unchallenged and has even made inroads from Bolivia to Nicaragua. And Chavez and his allies are not the only ones filling the vacuum. While the United States fails to address this changing reality in the Americas, others from Europe and Asia, notably China, have stepped up their own engagement. Iran has drawn closer to Venezuela, and just the other day, Tehran and Caracas launched a joint bank with their windfall oil profits." That's the Monroe Doctrine talking. So when Obama mentioned Hugo Chavez's checkbook diplomacy, he was condemning the idea that a country like Venezuela could control its own resources for the benefit of its people and other peoples and countries, and thus keep it out of the hands of Exxon and other oil giants. Let's not forget that hundreds of millions of gallons for several years were donated by Venezuela to poor communities in New York City, in Boston, and in native reservations during the winters. Why was Obama so bothered by Nicaragua and Bolivia and Venezuela, to mention them? It's because the decade of the 2000s was the unprecedented uniting of governments and countries that were breaking away from the very domination of U.S. imperialism. It hadn't happened before on this scale. By 2004, Venezuela and Cuba had founded the ALBA Alliance, which stands for Bolivarian Alliance for the Americas. It meant the member nations of this organization who joined would share resources and human solidarity on an equitable basis. It was Cuban doctors and teachers being sent by the tens of thousands to these countries. In turn, Venezuela provided oil and other countries provided food. Each year, more countries were inspired to join. With Cuba and Venezuela as the beginning of this organization, in 2006, peoples of Latin America, fed up with cutbacks, poverty, neoliberal programs, responded by electing similar leftist candidates. In that year, Daniel Ortega, who had been a leader of the Nicaraguan 1979 revolution before it was devastated by a U.S. contra-war which killed more than 50,000 people, he was reelected in 2006 with 38% of the vote. In his first term, economic reforms to benefit the population began to turn the economy around, also with the help of ALBA resources. A literacy campaign led by Cuban teachers made Nicaragua the third country in Latin America to be free of illiteracy. The second was Venezuela, with the help of Cuban teachers, and the first was Cuba, of course, in 1961. Ortega's vote, his election, the second time around, grew from 38% to 62% in 2011, and 2 years ago, he won a third time with 72% of the vote, and 5 parties running against him. This is the country that the U.S. has targeted precisely for that reason. And Ecuador, well, Rafael Correa was elected in 2006 on a platform of challenging the banks, which had enormously increased the country's debts. He was elected the same year as Ortega. His government, called the Citizen Revolution, declared a drastic reduction in what the government would pay to the IMF and World Bank. That's taken on the U.S. Much of the country's income was used instead for social programs, healthcare, education, and poverty was reduced from 36.7% to 22.5% in 10 years. New constitution. But probably what angered the U.S. most about Correa was that the only U.S. military base in Latin America at the time was in Ecuador, Manta Air Base. And he refused to renew the lease. It was shut down 3 years into his presidency. And, of course, Colombia took up the slack with several military bases being built now. Evo Morales was elected in 2004 and has been reelected since then. What was his crime in the eyes of U.S. imperialism? Well, Bolivia has one of the largest reserves of natural gas in the world, just almost limitless, and oil as well. Before his presidency, the hydrocarbon corporations, mainly U.S., but European too, paid only 18% of the profits to the Bolivian state. A new law changed that and flipped the percentage to the corporations having to pay 82% of their profits to the state. This enabled an increase in pensions, wages, reduction in poverty, schools, and other development. As you may know, Nicaragua's revolution of 1979 was devastated by 11 years of U.S. direct financing of the Contra-War, which killed, as I said, 50,000 people. The aim was to destroy the revolution. More than $1 billion was poured by the U.S. to fund the Contra-terrorists. And finally, after 11 years and the exhaustion of the population, the FSLN, the Liberation Force, agreed to elections, which they lost. And so the right wing had their way for 16 years. Poverty grew, neoliberalism grew, U.S. domination grew. This is why Daniel Ortega was elected 3 times recently. So what was the supposed reason for the latest outbreak of violence in Nicaragua, which has not happened in years? I have met right-wing Nicaraguans who live in the U.S., in San Francisco, who have been to Nicaragua lately, who even remark positively how much peace there has been in the country and how much development there has been that they have seen. Well, the excuse for the violence was that the government was proposing changes to the pension system in April. For example, lowering future payments, increasing by a small percentage the part that the workers would have to pay into the pension plan, and the corporations had to pay a much higher percentage. The aging of the populations in many countries has put into risk a lot of pension plans. Well, that was the pretext, and suddenly young masked gangs of youth were engaging in violent attacks, burning down buildings, now killing more than 260 people. I know from my own workplace experience with our pension and all the years I worked, that young people do not protest the issue of pensions. That's not the first thing on their minds. When I was working, if you were under 40, you were fighting for a bigger wage. When you're over 40, you were fighting for that money to go into your pension. Why were there no older people protesting? Because it was an attempt at a putsch in Nicaragua that comes from the playbook of the CIA, much like the scene of Venezuela a few years ago. Unfortunately, some of the left in the U.S. is buying into the U.S. position, hook, line, and sinker. And this completely mistaken position in seeing people in the street protesting and thinking, well, I identify with that. Well, how can you identify with people who burn buildings and kill? Schools, government buildings. It's a completely engineered plot. In fact, between 2014 and 2017, the CIA front, known as the National Endowment for Democracy, or NED, spent $4.2 million that we know of to create the opposition that would overthrow Ortega. But the other day, and you can see in Liberation News on the website that was just posted, an article that shows that hundreds of thousands of people out of a population that's only a few million are in the streets defending the government and their country. What's the unfolding situation as we speak? Luis da Silva, the most popular person, political person in Brazil who would definitely win an election if he were allowed to run, is now in prison, sentenced to 12 years, thanks to an engineered coup against President Dilma Rousseff, who was also expelled, and then the false persecution of Lula. However, in these days, there's a massive mobilization on different fronts of people in Brazil who are running him for president again, even though he's not allowed, who are engaging in all kinds of mobilization for his right to be free. Rafael Correa, who I mentioned before, third-term president from 2007 to 2017, declared the international debt illegitimate, among other things, is now a hunted man. He's in Belgium. And with the right-wing government of this new president, Moreno, this judge has ordered his extradition from Belgium. She's asked for Interpol to arrest him and extradite him to Ecuador. The purpose of it is to prevent him from being a leader again in the country. And it's highly likely that U.S. Vice President Mike Pence issued the dictate for his arrest, since he visited Ecuador 4 days before that order. Both Ecuador and Nicaragua were members of ALBA, although Ecuador's future in that body is a question now. And also of note is that Honduras had joined ALBA soon after Mel Zelaya's election, even though he did not come in as a progressive. The movement of the people in Honduras in 2008 and 2009, gathering 1 million signatures demanding a constitutional reform, a new constituent assembly for a new constitution that would represent their needs, that was about to be on a non-binding referendum the very day he was overthrown. It's really remarkable when you look at this U.S. aggression against Venezuela, that they have survived in the face of the U.S. corporate, imperialist, and Venezuelan right-wing's aggression. The assassination attempts, the overthrow for 48 hours of Hugo Chavez, the oil sabotage, which almost destroyed the oil industry in 2002, and using international bodies to try to isolate Venezuela like they did in the Organization of American States. And by the way, the OAS, which is U.S. and Canadian dominated, it's an instrument of the United States against any progressive movement in the continent. It was countered in that same decade of progress by the formation of the ALBA countries of an entity called CELAC, the Community of Latin American and Caribbean States, which does not include the U.S. and Canada. That's a threat to the OAS, which the U.S. would not accept. But the more that U.S. tactics are failing, they will resort perhaps to the military route. And why we must be very, very aware of what's really going on, read our media, read the leftist media, to be clear on the fact that we oppose every U.S. imperialist and right-wing maneuver against these countries. Just when one could think that the days of coup, of all the murderous regimes that the U.S. backed and installed from Guatemala to Argentina to Chile to Brazil, the hundreds of thousands of people who've been killed since the 50s, the attempt to destroy the Cuban Revolution, the Bay of Pigs invasion, on and on, we could hope or think that those days would be past. But U.S. imperialism still exists. And there's not one country in the world that's left in peace that wants to develop independent of U.S. capital. And then there's Cuba. On January 1st, 1959, which will be the 60th anniversary this coming year, with dictator Batista's flight abroad, the complete repressive state of the police, army, the butchers, it collapsed overnight, and a new socialist state was replaced, allowing for workers' power to take place. First, the U.S. properties were expropriated, and then later, the completion by expropriation of the rest of private wealth. That's when, on April 16, 1961, the socialist character was openly declared. But we always consider that the socialist revolution began on January 1, 1959. And it is amazing that Cuba has not only survived 55 years of severe, devastating blockade, terrorist attacks that have killed more than 3,400 Cubans, destroyed so much infrastructure that it continues to spread its internationalism around the world. We remember the days of 300,000 Cubans who volunteered to fight in Angola, to smash the South African apartheid regime army, to bring about, to help bring about the freedom from apartheid of the black South African masses who had fought for so many decades. The freedom, the independence of Namibia, which was possible because of Cuba's role. And the fact that universal and accessible and healthcare is available to everyone, free, and education, that you can get a PhD in Cuba without paying a penny. I just returned from Cuba 5 days ago with a delegation of 15 people, almost all being PSL members. And in Santiago de Cuba province that we were visiting, which has millions in population, the infant mortality rate for that whole province.
That's all we have for this week. You have been listening to People's Republic with Brian Griffith. People's Republic is produced at KOOP Community Radio in Austin, Texas, and is also syndicated on WHIV 102.3 FM in New Orleans. You can find our show on SoundCloud, iTunes, Spreaker, Spotify, and Stitcher by typing in People's Republic, or you can visit us on Facebook and Twitter at People's Radio ATX. Thanks for listening as we report on the global struggle for social and economic justice. We are out of here.